Welcome back, everyone. It's our last session, which is regulation. Appreciate it's not the lightest topic to finish up with, but we're going all around the world for this one, so I think it's going to be really interesting. So first up is Taylor Hardwick, with her paper with Marcus Carter, Tianyi ZHANGSHAO, Ben Egliston, and Leon Xiao. Literally just child gambling. Children paid chance features in games in the Australian context.
Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Hello, I'm Taylor Hardwick from RMIT University in Melbourne. First, I'd like to thank Leon for inviting me to speak to you all today. I'm really keen to chat to you on behalf of my co-authors, Marcus Carter, Tianyi ZHANGSHAO, Ben Egliston, and Leon Xiao. And I'll be talking about some of our research on paid random chance features and Australia's attempts to regulate them, regulate children's access to them via the National Classification Scheme. So this work forms part of a broader government-funded project which is led by Marcus, which broadly looks at how children are monetised by digital games. And so today I'll be focusing in on two studies that we've conducted as part of this research. The first one is a study where we interviewed children about their experiences with spending money in games, and I'll be focusing on what they told us about engaging with paid random chance features. And then I'll share findings from a more recent study we've conducted on compliance with Australia's minimum age classifications legislation, which was introduced at the end of 2024. So ultimately, I'll be making the case that Australia's current regulatory approach to paid random chance features are not adequate for actually protecting children from the harm that these features pose to them. So the games that Australian children play tend to be free to play. Roblox, Fortnite and Minecraft are particularly popular with Australian kids. And discussions about children and gameplay have recently had significant focus on paid random reward mechanisms, which I will very clumsily refer to as RRMs, including, but of course not limited to, loot boxes, with broad concerns around gambling. And so research has demonstrated that these mechanics are emotionally and financially harmful to children. But children also really value the purchases that they make in games. Lucas, you're missing my talk. And that these in-game purchases are important for children's social lives and identity negotiation. But when monetised, these features typically haven't been regulated as gambling, particularly not in Australia, so they aren't age-restricted in most contexts, despite presenting harm to children's well-being. So in the first study, we conducted interviews with 22 children aged 7 to 14 and their parents, but I won't be speaking about that data today. All you need to know is that parents hate it when their children gamble. So in the interviews, we gave children a $20 Australian voucher to buy anything that they liked. It didn't have to be something in a game. So I will note here that children in our cohort mostly played games in Roblox. Roblox is, of course, a platform, not a game in itself, and I'll talk a bit about that later. With Fortnite a pretty distant second. And their purchases really reflected that. So in these games, you first must purchase a virtual currency before you can go on to purchase anything in the game itself. So once children had purchased their virtual currency with their voucher, most kids then went to buy cosmetic items like skins and other microtransactional purchases. 3 children bought a non-digital item. 1 child spent her entire $20 on lollies, which is frankly iconic. And maybe not better, I don't know. And only 2 children engaged with a random reward mechanic. And this was really curious to me because Roblox games in particular at the time of our interviews in mid-2024 were absolutely rife with randomised, monetised features. But the kids we were talking to expressed to us that they didn't like them. RRMs didn't make them feel good. So of course, as we learned in the previous talk before the break, the way these features of work is to obfuscate the chances of receiving particular items or rewards, thus encouraging further purchasing. And researchers argued that children are ill-equipped to navigate illusions of control, probabilities, and risk. So this makes them particularly susceptible to the harms posed by gambling, and research around this typically focuses on children using slot machines, right? So traditional gambling. But children in our study expressed that these features made them feel upset, regretful, and stressed. And one child described the example on the screen, which is the Roblox game Pet Simulator 99, it is absolute garbage, as, quote, literally child gambling. And so this rhetoric around gambling is present in the way that children conceptualize these features too. And I'll say here that I'm quite cautious about the dominant focus on gambling as the primary vector of harm posed to children by their in-game spending. I think it limits our understanding of the broader picture of problematic monetization strategies. In a paper we've published presenting this study, we argue that children articulated to us that they experienced harm from spending money in games, as when they're deceived or tricked or scammed by monetization features. And so these kind of chance mechanics are only one vector of harm, but RRMs are designed to be deceptive, right? That's the point. So my first argument here is that children shouldn't have access to paid chance features in games, and the challenge thus far has been regulating this access. So globally, of course, there have been various approaches to regulating loot boxes and similar paid chance features, including outright bans, probability disclosures, and advertising disclosures. These all have their problems and concerns regarding enforcement and compliance, and of course, you should just go and read anything Leon's ever written for more information on that. But Australia has decided to take a different approach, one focused particularly on limiting children's access to games with random chance features via classification. So in Australia, we have the Classifications, Publications, Film and Computer Games Act of 1995, which establishes a minimum age rating empowered by the National Classification Board for all media texts, right? So in Australia, we know exactly, based on how old we are, what we can watch or read or play. And so there's a number of different ratings. I've got the key ones up on screen, beginning at G for general audiences, think a Disney movie, all the way down to R18+, which is legally restricted to adults, think the Better Than It Should Be game, South Park, The Stick of Truth. So I'll point out that M, mature audiences 15, is an advisory rating. So it's not legally enforceable. It exists to guide parents on content which may be inappropriate for their children. MA15 is also restricted for 15 and up, but this is legally enforceable, and it typically applies to texts with strong impact content like sex and violence. So from September 2024, the legislation was amended to introduce a mandatory minimum classification of M for games that feature in-game purchases linked to elements of chance, including paid loot boxes that can be acquired in a game, A, using real-world currency, or B, using in-game virtual currency, items or credits that can be purchased using real-world currency. So I will note that this wasn't applied retroactively, so an already released game which didn't have to be reclassified, only games which were released or significantly modified to include gambling-like content after the 22nd of September 2024. So a game with a loot box in it, rated PG, was only considered non-compliant if it was released or significantly modified after this date. Otherwise, it was totally cool to remain classified as PG. I'll also note here that games with simulated gambling required an R18+ rating, but I won't talk about that today. So the story of why we decided to study compliance with the scheme is probably best told by Leon over a beer later. But about 6 months after the scheme's introduction, we set out to evaluate compliance with the legislation. Tianyi did all of the data collection. I don't know where he is, but he is amazing. And we examined the top 100 highest grossing games on the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store for a total of 115 games, because there was some overlap between the two stores. In our study, we didn't include sandbox or user-generated content-based games and platforms like Minecraft or Roblox, though they were both in the top 100, and of course Roblox demonstrably included these kinds of features, but the final sample was about 98 games on both platforms. So Tianyi played an hour of each game to assess the presence. I don't know why you look so embarrassed, dude, it's work. to assess the presence and type of paid RRMs and simulated gambling, and list down any age ratings as listed on the relevant app store, the game's website, within the game itself, and any policy documents like terms and conditions. It was here that we realised that many of the games actually presented many different age ratings across all of these different spaces, which made this study extremely confusing, and we are literally experts, so I can't imagine what it was like to be a parent trying to navigate all of this, and we ended up writing another paper about that, which is currently under review. So on the Apple App Store, a total of 20 out of the 98 games, so 20.4%, were non-compliant. So that is to say, they were rated lower than M, despite the presence of chance-based features in games that had been released or significantly modified since September 2024. The story on the Google Play Store was even more grim. So 48 of the 98 games were non-compliant. This is kind of staggering, and it suggests, unsurprisingly, that there are some problems with the scheme. And here I'll note that we retested for compliance in September 2025, a year after the scheme's introduction, and the results were marginally more positive, but still significant. I believe at that time 46 of the games on the Google Play Store were non-compliant rather than 48. So the first of the problems is that compliance with the scheme is self-regulated and assessed. So usually the classification board would bestow a rating upon a media text, but in this case, developers were responsible for giving themselves the rating. Given this, there was a total lack of guidance and time for developers in the lead up to the scheme coming into effect, with detailed instructions being made public only days before the legislation began, right? There was also a general lack of enforcement, so the classification board certainly isn't going to spend an hour playing each of these games to assess compliance. And if caught out, the consequence is a paltry $6,600 Australian fine. And the legislation doesn't account for user-generated content platforms like Roblox, and it allows them to claim plausible deniability, as Roblox doesn't actually produce any content, right? So instead, the people who make the games on Roblox are responsible for ensuring the game is compliant with the legislation. And this is problematic because, thank you, Roblox promotes itself as a space for children to make games. And I'm going to be brave and say that the expectation for a 12-year-old to be an expert in Australian classification law or face a $6,000 fine is perhaps unreasonable. So we have to question, is the classification legislation fit for purpose? I mean, no. But we had some ideas for how it could be improved. So first, these paid chance features, sorry, I've said loot boxes, it should be paid chance features, should be classified as A15+, a legally enforceable rating rather than advisory. All games should require classification. It doesn't make sense for there to be a difference based on when a game was or wasn't released. And penalties should incentivize classification. So the kind of facetious 12-year-old example aside, in Australia, an independent game developer might be financially ruined by a $6,000 fine, but Roblox's revenue last year was $4.9 billion. So we can argue if the punishment befits the crime across these scales. The classification board should do more. And then, speaking of Roblox, games platforms should not be exempt. After some media pressure, after we started doing this study, Roblox did require games with random chance features in Australia to restrict access to players with accounts aged 15 and under via the use of APIs. I don't understand what that does, so please don't ask me. But this means that an 8-year-old can no longer access the literally child gambling features in Pet Simulator 99, for instance, if they have an account that is accurate for their age. But some of these games introduced problematic alternatives to this because monetization is still key to how many Roblox games work. And I won't get into that here, but feel free to ask me about it in questions. The law doesn't differentiate between gambling aesthetics and gambling mechanics, and I haven't spoken about simulated gambling, but it's problematic because it treats these two as equivalent, despite no evidence that gambling aesthetics, so here we're thinking about games like Balatro, which rules, can cause harm. And finally, we think that app stores should have to inform users if a game's rating changes after they've downloaded it to allow children and their parents to remain informed about the content they're engaging with. So I guess to wrap up, the scheme is a step in a direction toward effective regulation that protects children from harm posed by deceptive monetization features like paid chance mechanics, but it is certainly not perfect in its current form. You can access a preprint for our paper here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic. Any questions? Over here.
Yes, perfect. Thank you, Taylor.
Thank you.
I have a question about the. Could you go one slide back, basically? About the active monitoring of compliance, right? Like you said that initially the first scheme was okay. The developers themselves have to rate themselves. Basically, the addict has to rate themselves in this case, right? And I assume that they did that because of resources. Isn't that then still a problem when it comes to active monitoring of compliance? How would you imagine? This is a nasty question, and I'm seriously like wondering how this can be done, right? Like, how can we, when the resource of active monitoring is already so poor, how can we then do this? How can that happen?
Yeah, I actually don't know. I do think that the classification board did a really good job of washing their hands of this legislation after enacting it. And so I do think that that's not a particularly responsible government response to legislation. So I suppose my thoughts are educate developers better so that they can be genuinely informed about the communication around their game. Invest in those resources, they're worth it. But I also think that platforms could play a role here, and I don't think that Apple should be the arbiter of, Australian law, but I think that there is a role here given the hoops that game developers have to jump through in order to publish their games on these platforms for this to potentially be a space where the platform itself could do some of this monitoring of compliance and regulation. I don't have an answer on that, but I do think it is the government's job to maybe think a bit more about it.
Same problem.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
That's a great question.
Question over here as well.
I think Callum should just have a microphone.
Do not let me just keep a microphone. That's like the worst possible idea. There's a reason this one has been turned off. So how much do you think the historical reputation of the Australian age rating regulator has played into this? Like, it has somewhat of a comedic reputation for banning Doom, random game bannings. Do you think there's kind of been a breakdown of respect isn't the right word, but that sort of thing? A developer's just the regulator's a bit of a joke, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will say to anyone who's not Australian, classifications are more like guidelines and actual rules regardless of the legal enforceability. It's not unusual for a child to watch an R18 movie. In the game space, there was significant advocacy by game players in the 2000s, ultimately culminating in an R18 plus rating being introduced for games in 2012. And look, it's imperfect and I think broadly considered pretty draconian as a form of censorship, which is of course what the classification board is there to do. It's there to censor. So as you say, Dune Awakening is rated R18 plus in Australia because of the representation of drug use, which, if anyone is familiar with the text of Dune, is a wild misreading, right? So I think that there is kind of, I don't know if I would say that it's considered a joke in Australia, but a lack of trust in the classification board's decision making. I don't know that that's the problem here. I don't know that that's why developers haven't made these choices. I mean, what we're looking at is games which are predominantly made overseas for mobile platforms. So I wonder how many developers are aware that they had to make these changes, right? And also, given that there's no actual consequence, why would they care? And so Roblox ended up folding because we got really loud in the news about it, and Roblox really saw that as impacting their bottom line. But I don't know. I think it's a complex issue, and awareness is bigger than taking it seriously. Thanks.
That's all the questions that we've got time for.
Great,
Thank you. That was fantastic.